Hi, good evening. My name is Marisa de la Torre, and Malik is one of my co-authors in this report. And we are very excited to have the opportunity to share with you today some of the highlights of the report. This report is about, once the schools close, how families decided where to send their kids and where they end up the kids enrolling after the schools close. So as we saw in the documentary, elementary schools closed at the end of 2013 because of underutilization issues. With the intention, the district had the intention of sending kids to higher performing schools. This is a quote by CPS CEO Barbara Bennett back in March of 2013, where she said, "By consolidating these schools, we can focus on safely getting every child into a better performing school close to their home." As the quote suggests, the district thought about placing kids in higher performing welcoming schools, but they also thought about the safety and the distance that the kids have to travel. So welcoming schools were chosen to be within a mile distance of the closest school, and the district also expanded the Safe Passage program that they already had in some schools to cover all the 48 designated welcoming schools in the system. They also put some resources and invested some money into the welcoming schools to provide a better learning environment in those schools. Parents, however, lamented the loss of these schools and worried about their children's transition to a new school. One of the parents that we talked to during our study said, "Any loss is sad or devastating, no matter if you are in kindergarten, pre-K, or 8th grader. Because it's everybody's school. It's not just a school, it's everybody's school." Another parent told us, "I'm sorry schools all across the city had to close, and there are so many kids with special needs or not that had to start all over again and have their whole lives kind of uprooted and start a new routine." So parents were concerned about the transition, and they had to decide where to send their kids. So in this study, we examined where the displaced students enrolled the next fall, and we go into some of the reasons why we saw these decisions. We use administrative data, and we follow all the elementary grade students that were enrolled in the closest schools back in May of 2013. And we follow them the fall of 2013 to see where they enroll. We also interviewed 95 families whose children were enrolled in these closest schools because we wanted to understand the reasons behind all these decisions. And we sampled the families to really represent a range of different experiences. We interviewed families in the north side, in the south side, in the west side. We interviewed families with kids of different age ranges, as well as families that went to the designated welcoming schools and families that enroll in other CBS schools. So the question is, where did these displaced students enroll the following fall? So one of the first findings in our report is that 94% of the students stayed in a CPS school. They re-enrolled in another CPS school the following fall. It was a concern of many people that families after the school closures would decide not to enroll in a CPS school again. But what we see is that this rate is very similar to what we observed in prior years, so we don't see a lot of families leaving the system after the school closures. Of the kids that re-enrolled in a CPS school in the fall of 2013, 93 enrolled in schools with higher performance rating than the closest school. But some of those schools were not substantially much better performing. And what we find is that 21% enrolled in a level 1 school or schools that the district labeled as excellent standing. 66% of the students that re-enrolled in a CPS school did so in one of the welcoming schools. Those were the schools that were receiving the extra resources to improve their learning environments, but 1/3 did not attend those schools. When we look at what were the reasons why some families enroll in the designated welcoming schools using the administrative data, we see that families were more likely to enroll in welcoming schools if the school was close to their residence. Proximity was one of the factors. If the school had a strong safety records from the My Voice, My School survey, and also if the closest school if the designated school moved into the building of the closest school. So those three reasons really explain a lot of these decisions behind enrolling in a welcoming school. One thing that surprised us in the report is that families that were assigned to a level 3 school were more likely to enroll in those schools versus families that were enrolled in a level 1 school, those schools that were in excellent standing. And I think Malik will talk later, will give you a few reasons of why this was happening for some of the families. So we see that some of these decisions behind enrolling in designated welcoming schools had to do with proximity and with some of the characteristics of the welcoming schools. And when we look at whether some of the student characteristics matter for enrolling or not in designated schools, we see that those student characteristics didn't matter for whether families enroll in designated places or not. Another issue that was raised in the documentary is that the school closings might have affected disproportionately African American families and also some of the most vulnerable students in the district. So we look at the data, and what we see when we look at the students that were enrolling in the closed schools is that 88% of them were African American. A lot of them were coming from low-income neighborhoods with low income, and they were receiving free and reduced price lunch. They were also more likely to receive special education services. These families were more mobile, changing residence. They were more likely to be changing residences than the other families in CPS. And they also they are coming from neighborhoods where the crime rates are higher than in other places. So these things, keep these things in mind when Malik goes through some of the reasons that we see behind why families enroll in these places. This is something to keep in mind because it might be more challenging for these families to enroll in some of these schools.
So once the final list of closed schools were announced, families had to turn their attention to finding a new school for their children. We wanted to better understand why families enrolled their children where they did, and what criteria mattered to them as they were going through that enrollment process. This picture is a word cloud of some of the phrases and criteria that mattered to the families that we interviewed. The size of the phrases have to do with, correspond with the number of families who mentioned these things. So the first thing that you probably noticed that jumps out is that the majority of families wanted to find a school that was close to their home. When we think of close to home, we often think of convenience, but the way that families talked about close to home and proximity to home was more nuanced than that. Families talked about or worried about such things as, what if the weather is bad? How am I going to get my child from school? Or what if my car breaks down? And they wanted to make sure that they had a school that was close to home for those practical reasons. Another thing that you will notice is that many, many families talked about safety and in particular safe commute. And a safe commute and proximity to home were very interrelated. So for many families, finding a school closer to home felt safer to them. A school may offer many things, but if a family felt that getting to that school or the school environment was unsafe, they decided not to even attempt to enroll their children there. In other words, safety trumps many other things that a school might be able to offer. Another phrase that you'll see on there is transportation costs. So for many families who could not afford transportation costs, the number of options that they had were really limited to the options they had in their neighborhood. Another set of phrases you'll see up there have to do with academic and performance. So you'll see individualized academic attention, good teachers, and after-school programs. All of those phrases kind of sum up what families thought in terms of what a good quality academic school may be. One thing that was interesting to us is that as families talked about what it meant to have a good school, families talked in much broader terms than simple performance measures. So of course, families care about test scores, and they care about grades, but they care about a lot of other things that have to do with the academic environment. For example, some of our interviews said, I want to make sure my child goes to a school where the class sizes are small and reasonable. I want to make sure that my child gets the individualized academic attention that they need in schools to be able to grow. Or a curriculum or a program. All of those things encompassed what a good academic environment meant for families. Lastly, on this word cloud, you'll see a group of phrases that have to do with personal connections to the schools. So you'll see family connections or closed school staff transferred to the new school. So one of the family members that we talked to, for example, was telling me about her process as she was thinking about which school would work best for her children. And she was a little hesitant about sending her child to the welcoming school. But she called them up, and the secretary of the closed school actually answered the phone. And she said, "Oh my gosh, you're at the new school?" And the secretary said, "Yes, actually a lot of the staff are transferring over here." And the mother said, "Okay, that's it. I'm sending my child there because I want them to go to an environment where they know someone." Okay, once families were going through this process, some faced barriers which ended up limiting their school options. And I've already mentioned some safety concerns. That, again, if families felt that a school was not safe for their child to get to or go to, oftentimes that school was taken out of consideration. And again, lack of transportation. If you don't have it or you worry about your car breaking down, then your options are further limited to what's in your neighborhood. Students with IEPs had a particularly, or families with students with IEPs had a particularly difficult time finding schools that had the necessary supports and services that their children needed. Because the school closings announcement came in late May, families ended up having a more limited set of schools that they could choose from because the application and enrollment process begins in December. So many families talked about trying to get into certain schools and not being able to because it was full. A lot of families also told us that they felt that the time, because the announcement was made so late, that they didn't have enough time to properly research and investigate which schools would work for their children. Many families said they wished they had more time to figure out and look at the options that they had. Okay, in sum, when closing schools, trying to send students to better performing schools is a sensible goal. And what we found is that nearly all students enrolled in higher rated schools, but only 21% of students ended up in top tier or level 1 schools. And that is partly because there's a lack of highly rated schools in some neighborhoods. We also learned a little bit more about what matters to families. Families want a school. We learned that families want a school that's close to home. They want a school that's safe. And they also want a school that has a good academic environment, more broadly defined than simply test scores. Although families, in theory, had a choice to send their children to any school with open seats, in reality, many families faced just constraints getting into some other schools of their choice. So again, I mentioned the time constraints and resource constraints. There were other constraints, budgetary limitations, that limited families' choice options. Going forward, as other districts look to shape closings policies that will at once save money and optimize student learning at the same time, it is imperative to understand the mechanisms that facilitate or constrain families from enrolling their children into higher performing schools that also meet their needs.